Epochs! We have noted that Henry was extremely cautious in his strategic moves to this point. He demonstrated a high degree of caution in his choice of landing place at Harfleur. He was very cautious in his attacks on the walls of that town, preferring to blast at them rather than risk sustained assaults. After leaving Harfleur, he did not attack any other town and avoided confrontation wherever he could, at Blanchecreux and after leaving Peronne. So for him now to be reluctant to give up his defensive position was entirely in character and understandable. That he did so, and gave the order to advance banners, was a mark of outstanding courage. It proved to be the single most important decision of his life. Yeah, it does seem to be, doesn't it, that when you look at the battle as a whole, that everything Henry did kind of worked perfectly. And this is part of it. It's still the opening gambit, isn't it, really, of the battle? But it seems like it was something he needed to do. In hindsight, it was probably the perfect thing to do. Okay, Ian Mortimer continues. One struggles to imagine what went through the minds of the English archers when the word went round to advance. They, the few, hungry and fatigued, were going to advance against this seeming mass of French men-at-arms, their social and military superiors. In order for their bows to work effectively, they would certainly need to be within 200 yards of the enemy, and preferably less than half of that to shoot accurately. A charging mounted man-at-arms could cover a distance of 100 yards in 10 seconds, so the archers could be charged down before they came within effective killing range. The one advantage they had was that they could shoot rapidly. Crossbowmen in such a situation would have been helpless, because they could not shoot quickly enough, but archers could loose a dozen or more arrows a minute. Against 1,000 charging knights on horseback, each weighing half a ton and travelling at 600 yards per minute, 20 miles per hour, this was crucial, for only by bringing down enough horses could they slow the charge. The question was, could the English archers get close enough to bring down enough horses? When the order was given to prepare for the banners to advance, the English were terrified but ready. All the men-at-arms had dismounted and were ready to run in their armour. Some of the archers were preparing to take their stakes with them. Others just knew that they had to advance quickly and decided to leave their stakes behind. Others were probably too scared to know what they should do. Many men were praying, many were bending down and putting a small piece of earth into their mouths, preparing for the moment of their death and the last judgment. Then, out in front of the massed army, rode the old Sir Thomas Erpingham, with his complement of men-at-arms. At the back, seated on a horse, with the author of the Gesta, was the other priests, all of them praying desperately, with their faces turned towards heaven. Remember us, O Lord, our enemies are gathered together, and boast of their excellence. Destroy their strength and scatter them, so that they may understand that there is none other that fights us but you, our God. Have compassion upon us and upon the crown of England. All eyes were fixed on Sir Thomas Erpingham. Those hidden in the woods on the flanks were watching him. The archers in each wing were watching him, and so too was the king. So were the men-at-arms in the main battle. And then, in full view of them all, he yelled out, "Now strike!" and threw a white baton spinning high into the air for all to see. A huge shout went up across the English lines, and men began moving forward. Everyone was running through the wet mud, archers, men-at-arms, knights and lords, even the king. Sir Thomas Erpingham and his men hurriedly dismounted and joined in the king's battle, Sir Thomas running forward despite his advanced years. The archers were lightly armed and were able to run much faster than the men-at-arms in the thick mud, but even they had a struggle. They had to get within range of the French front lines and start shooting arrows before the French cavalry charged into them and broke their ranks. As they ran, they must have looked ahead and seen that the French had realised what was happening. Some Frenchmen were mounting their horses and beginning to move. Others were shouting to one another to take arms. So a bit of a split-second thing going on here. It's sort of all in the balance. Can the English archers get forward quickly enough to loose even a few arrows before the French, certainly the French cavalry, get their act together and charge them down? It's sort of a moment-to-moment thing, really. Often battles come down to it. Napoleon said battles are won and lost in 15 minutes. Sometimes it's much, much shorter than that. Sometimes it is just a few seconds make a difference. Can do. Henry's decision to attack was a stroke of genius. The French were taken by surprise. Jules Le Bouvier noted that at the moment the French heard the English shout, some had gone off to get warm, others to walk and feed their horses, not believing that the English would be so bold as to attack them. Clignet de Brabant, who had been instructed to lead the Tramecourt side wing in a charge to break up the archers, could only find 120 of the 600 men he had for the purpose. He could not wait for them all. There was no time. He shouted to those who were ready and charged. The English trumpets sounded, and the archers stopped and loosed a first barrage of arrows at Cligny de Brabant and his cavalry, sending them one by one into the mud or making them crash into one another, leaving riderless horses to charge into the French vanguard, disrupting their advance. At the same time, on the Agincourt side of the battlefield, only 300 men could be found of the 600 men to form the charge on that wing. They were met with a terrifying hail of arrows from the English, and they too turned back, with the exception of Guillaume de Souviers and 2 of his men, who charged on fearlessly to their deaths when they came close enough for the arrows to penetrate their armour. So Ian Mortimer telling us of showers of arrows, hails of arrows. If you remember last time, one of the historians said there was no shower of arrows, but there was. I mean, all the accounts seem to say there was at least some. Well, most of them agree that the archers run out of arrows, so they must have fired them. Ian Mortimer continues. A few minutes earlier, the French commanders had been wholly confident of victory. Suddenly, they had cause for grave concern, as their sole means of breaking up the ranks of English archers had shattered on a hailstorm of arrows. The problem was the mud. It was so thick that the men-at-arms on the wings could not gallop. The lightly armoured English archers were thus able to get close and send showers of steel-headed arrows at them, while the French ponderously trudged through the churned-up sludge, slipping this way and that. The horses were terrified at the shouts and trumpets, as well as their lack of footing in the quagmire of sodden ground, and it was even worse than they had imagined, for the untrodden land on which they had charged was a newly ploughed field with soft earth that had soaked up the rain and now gave way between the horses' heavy hooves. The English archers were able to run forward again and shoot for their weak points in the horses' head and chest armour, and for their legs. If they got within 30 yards, close enough to puncture the steel armour, they could target the men-at-arms themselves, sending the riderless horses careering back, terrified, into the French vanguard. The French commanders could only look on with dismay and mounting consternation as the riders on the wings rode chaotically back into the vanguard. Even those who had not lost their horses and who had clung on had great difficulty controlling their steeds as they careered in panic away from the arrows. No horses could have been trained to face such an onslaught, and nor could their riders have expected their sudden inability to ride together in formation. There was only one option left open: to sound the trumpets, commanding a full onslaught of all the troops, and to overwhelm the English through sheer force of numbers. To this end, they followed what must have been a prearranged plan, dividing into 3 columns, one for each of the English battles. They charged together, men and steel spears aiming for the hearts of the English commanders, where the standards of the Duke of York, the King, and Lord Camoys were being held aloft. Few Englishmen can ever have seen a charge of 8,000 men-at-arms. None of the Englishmen at Agincourt that day had done. No one can have been confident that they would withstand such a colossal attack, but they all knew what they had to do. They were engaged in a fight for their lives. They had been facing death since leaving Harfleur, and it showed in their readiness to throw themselves into the fray. The French, on the other hand, had thought up until now that they were simply engaged in a quest for glory. It had not occurred to them that they might actually lose this battle. Their confidence had been rocked, and it was shaken even more as they charged, alarmed and in confusion, for the 200 English archers, hidden in the woods on the Tramecourt side of the battlefield, opened their shoulders and let fly a barrage of arrows. Turning to face them, the French on the Duke of York's side were distracted, and the next thing they knew, the Duke of York's archers ahead were advancing towards them. Between them, the English archers were shooting about 1,000 arrows every second, penetrating their armour, killing the horses beneath them, and making them rise up and fall over. Barrages of arrows were loosed, the coordinated flights of steel points a testimony to Henry's determination to bring his own self-doubt and all the questions of his legitimacy to a final, deadly resolution. It's all or nothing, right? It's a fight to the death. It's on. It's fully on. At the back of the English army, the priests had thrown themselves on the ground at the first sign of the French advance, begging that God in his mercy might spare them from this iron furnace and terrible death. If they had looked up at that moment, they would have seen the strange fruit that grew from the seed of the massed archers' arrows, huge piles of dead and dying men and horses, higher than the height of a man, more than 2 spears' height. That must have been a sight. Can you imagine? A massive pile of dead bodies. A massive pile of them, sort of a wave, a giant sort of crest wave of all these dead bodies and horses. It's sort of difficult to imagine, really, isn't it? Like what that really looked like, and you know the horror of it as well. It had been remarked at the first great longbow victory at Duplin Moor that the charging men could not retreat, so they had to scramble over the dying men and horses in front of them. But at a rate of 1,000 arrows a second, no one could escape for long, and those climbing were also shot, making the barrier higher. Those at the bottom were held immobile and crushed, some suffocated. The French could not find a way around the dead and dying, as the woods on either side held them to the same small patch of ground. Those in the third rank of one column of the French vanguard were so tightly packed that they could not use their swords, and they could see their horses being struck down and turning in flight. For those near them, it was deeply disturbing to see men like Guyard Dauphin and the Count of Vendôme yelling at their men to retreat. Such were the numbers of the French men-at-arms clambering over the dying front ranks that it seemed to the English that God was holding their enemies helpless for them, presenting them to be slaughtered. But not all the English were finding it easy to pick off the men-at-arms. The column of Frenchmen that pressed hardest was that facing the Duke of York. It was here that the fighting was fiercest. The archers may have run out of arrows, allowing the French advance to come on, and wearing quilted leather, not steel armour, they were no match for the fully armed men-at-arms. Their best hope in the hand-to-hand fighting was a previously unknown weapon, a weighted, sharp-pointed mallet designed for penetrating steel armour and helmets, a poleaxe. With these and normal axes, the archers fought against the French knights and esquires, hacking and bludgeoning them with short, rapid sweeps. But the French men-at-arms were trained to deal with hand-to-hand warfare. Gradually they advanced on the Duke of York's standard. The battle was so furious, so bitter, that all thoughts of taking prisoners had long since vanished. Englishmen tried to use their poleaxes to crush the helmets of the attacking Frenchmen. The French wielded their swords to cut and kill the English archers. In the Duke of York's own retinue, 90 men were killed as they fought to protect their lord. Despite their great struggle, the French managed to break through and strike the Duke himself. Down went the king's much-loved cousin into the mud, fighting to his death for his king. All his regrets about his brother's treason died there in the mud with him. Certainly the most high-profile casualty on the English side. But Mortimer goes on, York was not the only English casualty. The young Earl of Suffolk, eager to prove himself after his recent inheritance, was killed. So too was the recently dubbed knight Sir John Mortimer of Worcestershire, and Sir Richard Keigley of Lancashire, Sir John Skidmore of Herefordshire, Dafydd Gam of Breconshire, and many archers. At this stage of the battle, the English began to sustain terrible wounds from the swords of the French. But even on the hard-pressed Duke of York's side, the lords who were second in command, probably Sir Gilbert Umfraville and Sir John Cornwall, rallied the men so that the line did not break, and gradually the English became aware that they were actually holding the French and forcing them back. They could not retreat due to the press of men behind them, nor advance due to the strength of the English ahead, so the French onslaught turned into a supply chain of victims as each man fell and left room for another cumbersome man to wield his sword against the English poleaxes. The English, still in a state of terror, killed every Frenchman they could see in a few crazed minutes of frantic, panic-stricken killing. For these few minutes, as the men in the central French battle pressed forward, those in the column attacking the king were simply pushed towards the English men-at-arms who slaughtered them bloodily in a kill-or-be-killed frenzy. Indeed, the word kill is the operative one in the most accounts of this stage of the battle. And a line from the Times said, "No one was captured, many were killed," commented one chronicler, continuing, "The English were increasingly eager to kill, for it seemed that there was no hope of safety except in victory. They killed those near them, and then those who followed. Thus the French were pushed to their ignominious bloody deaths in the mud." Now Mortimer, when the French did stop pushing forward, it was not because of a general command. The men at the rear were beginning to withdraw. This allowed the English men-at-arms with Henry to break through the central column of the vanguard. When that happened, all was suddenly confusion in the French army. There were no columns, no vanguard, no main battle, just a mass of desperate men fighting for their lives, or trying to surrender and being killed as they tried to give themselves up. Few Englishmen had time to take prisoners. It was at this point, when the English were making real advances into the French ranks, that the intensity of the fighting around the king increased to an uncontrollable level. Some French chroniclers give the credit to the Duke of Alençon, burst through and hacked their way towards the king. The king's bodyguard came under attack and fell back. The king's brother, Humphrey, fell backwards under the force of the French onslaught, wounded in the groin, and was lying in a precarious position until Henry himself stepped forward and stood astride him, swinging his battle axe, fighting directly against the front rank of the enemy. In those long exposed moments, while Henry fought in person, the French realised that the King of England was within their reach and redoubled their efforts to kill him. Someone, perhaps the Duke of Alençon, or perhaps one of the 18 men of the Sieur de Croix, who had sworn to knock the crown from Henry's helmet, managed to break through and bring an axe down on his head. But they only succeeded in hacking off a portion of the gold crown, and as soon as the blow had been landed, the protagonist was beaten back by the knights who came to Henry's assistance, rescuing both the king and his brother in the same forward movement. And that's quite a moment, isn't it? I think I said it last time or earlier in this episode. The moment when, Henry V, one of the greatest martial medieval kings, is actually personally fighting in the front line. It's like when Caesar would fight in the front line. I mean, it's sort of glorious, isn't it? You sort of can't ask for much more than that when it comes to sort of cinematic or just a great image, great moment in time. That he stands astride his stricken brother, saving him, and all the great knights around him, and he's actually exchanging blows with Frenchmen on the muddy, bloody field of Agincourt. It's just great stuff, isn't it? If you're an Englishman, anyway. Ian Mortimer goes on. This was the scene that confronted the Duke of Brabant as he arrived now, about midday, having ridden hard from Laon, 30 miles away. He must have been exhausted. His horses must have been similarly exhausted. He stopped near a thicket, and seeing the dire situation in which the French army now found itself, realised that he had little time to prepare for battle. His armour, surcoat, and accoutrements of war were all in his baggage many miles behind, so he had one of his chamberlains, a Voskin, take off his armour. He ordered one of his trumpeters to tear off the Brabant coat of arms hanging from his trumpet, and having made a hole in the material, put it over his head as a makeshift surcoat. Another trumpeter handed over the Brabant arms to serve as a flag for the Duke's lance. Then, together with the few companions who had been able to keep up with him on the road from Laon, he yelled his war cry, "Brabant, Brabant," and set his spurs to charge into the fray. Bit foolhardy. One chronicler stated that the Duke of Brabant arrived with very few men, just those of his household, quote, right at the point of defeat, quote. Yes, I mean, it was gallant for the Duke of Brabant to just charge in immediately. It shows elan in the face of the enemy, but it was foolhardy. It was silly. There was, the day was already almost certainly lost for the French. It's kind of suicidal or near suicidal. Mortimer continues, in one respect, this was true. The balance had shifted. Many French were lying in the mud, bleeding to death, or trapped by their horses, or suffocating under a mass of bodies. Some were in flight. One of the Duke's own men, John de Grimberg, who had the hereditary right to carry the Brabant banner, took one look at the battlefield and galloped as fast as he could in the opposite direction. Run away, run away. But according to the Burgundian writers, the rearguard, or some body of men-at-arms that amounted to a rearguard, was still mounted at this point. The French who had taken flight were regrouping in companies. In the confusion, few people could establish what had happened. This regrouping by the French seems to have coincided with an attack on the English baggage wagons. The way almost all the chroniclers describe this attack is as an opportunistic looting spree, but there are good reasons to believe that it was a planned attack on the English, directed by a French commander. This would mean that the point at which the Duke of Brabant arrived was not the end of the battle. It only appeared to be so with the benefit of hindsight. So, now this classic dastardly French attack on the English baggage train that's just not cricket. Ian Mortimer says, when Henry had given the order to advance banners, he had also taken the precaution of ordering the baggage wagons to close up on the rear of the English army. Only 10 men-at-arms and 20 archers had been guarding the baggage, so it fell to them and the carters to bring forward the wagons and the horses, and to help the sick and the injured, and to protect the pages stationed at the rear. They had only partially accomplished this task, if indeed they had started it, so the baggage and horses remained largely in and around the village of Maisoncelles. It was attacked here by Isambard de Agincourt, Rifflard de Clement, Robinet de Bonville, and other men-at-arms, together with 600 local men, mainly drawn from Hesdin. The fact that men-at-arms were involved suggests that this was not meant to be a self-seeking raiding party, even if it turned into one. Nor was it without organisation. An attack on the English baggage had been envisioned in the first battle plan, drawn up at Rouen on or about the 12th, so ages ago. The French were attempting to do what the Black Prince had done at Poitiers when the battle was turning against him. On that occasion, the prince sent a small body of men to unfurl his banner at the rear of the French army and to attack the King of France's battle from behind. It only took a small number of troops on that occasion to cause confusion throughout the whole army. Such distractions could be decisive. But bringing them about was not easy. Hence, local men who knew the land had been sent to find their way around and attack the English from behind. The problem was that they had taken too long. When they came across such rich plunder as the English horses and the king's jewels, they delayed further to help themselves. They found a sword set in a jewel-encrusted gold scabbard that was supposed to have belonged to King Arthur. Obvious nonsense. And 2 crowns of gold, the orb, many precious stones, and a gold cross containing a piece of the true cross. Again, obvious nonsense. However, this failure to bring the baggage forward was a huge piece of luck, for the raid did not distract the English at all, and they continued to hold the French onslaught. By the time the men of Hesdin attacking the baggage wagons had been driven off, it was too late. The French line of defence was breaking up. The army was in flight. Those still mounted probably got away quite easily, as their opponents could not chase them and the archers had run out of arrows. But many, probably the majority, had lost their horses. Hundreds were lying under the huge piles of dead men, their limbs broken or bleeding heavily from arrow wounds, or simply unable to extricate themselves from the piles or from under their dead horses. Again, a scene of horror, really. Those in armour knew their part was done. They could await discovery and could in due course agree a ransom. For them there was no danger. Any wounded infantry on the battlefield knew their fate would be quite different. Those who could still walk were no doubt trying to flee or hide themselves as well as they could. So it looks like the day is won for Henry. We hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, please head over to lotuseaters.com for the full unabridged video.